In this video, we'll embark on an exciting expedition through the Queen's Gambit, masterfully navigated by Capablanca. We'll dissect 8 magnificent games in the Queen's Gambit, unfolding Capablanca's subtle maneuvers, flawless tactics, and deep strategic understanding. The first opponent is Henry Scott, a former British chess champion. Capablanca starts d4, and after black's d5, he offers the Queen's Gambit with c4. The Queen's Gambit is traditionally described as a gambit because white appears to sacrifice the c-pawn. However, this could be considered a misnomer because black can't keep the pawn without incurring a disadvantage. So most of the time the gambit is declined, and in this case black plays c6 to secure his pawn. Capablanca continues knight f3 developing, and black plays knight f6. e3 opens the white bishop, and black follows suit with e6. Now white wants to develop his bishop, but black would just capture the pawn on c4, forcing white to waste another move by recapturing with the bishop when the bishop was already developed. So white plays knight b to d2 so that the knight can recapture the pawn if it were captured and land on an active square. Black develops his own knight before white develops his bishop to d3, and black develops his bishop to d6. Both sides castle their kings to safety. The stage is set for a battle in the center, and Capablanca leads the charge with his pawn push to e4. The looming threat of e5 springing a fork drives black into releasing the tension with pawn takes e4. White recaptures with the knight, opening his bishop's eyes. Black captures the knight, white recaptures with the bishop, and black brings the other knight to f3 to attack the bishop, so it retreats to c2. The aftermath of this eruption in the center is white having commanding control over the center and pieces primed for an attack on the black king. Black, on the other hand, has to figure out a way to develop his final minor piece, as this e6 pawn doesn't have enough support to push to e5. So black plays b6 to go the other direction. Capablanca launches his attack with queen d3. Now the threat is bishop g5 to remove the defender of h7 and then take on h7 with checkmate. Black must put a stop to that, so he plays h6 to prevent the bishop from getting to g5. After that move, white's dark squared bishop no longer has a place on this diagonal, so white plays b3, planning to put the bishop on a potentially more destructive diagonal. Black's queen e7 prepares to put the rook on d8, and white develops his bishop to b2, aiming at the king side. Black shifts the rook to the semi-open d-file where it is lined up with white's queen. There's no immediate threat, so white just centralizes his rook before black finally develops his light-squared bishop. Capablanca leaves no piece untouched, bringing his rook into the game where it can almost see the black queen. Black swings his rook to c8 in preparation of a c5 pawn break in order to open up his pieces. Then white's knight hops to h4 with the idea of jumping to f5, taking advantage of the pin on the e6 pawn to fork the queen and the potent bishop. To save his bishop, black drops it all the way back to b8, and now he can play queen c7 with a threat of his own on the enemy king side. In anticipation, white plays g3, blunting the diagonal. At this point, black wants to untangle his pieces. He plays king f8, trying to escape white's menacing attack on the king side, and freeing up his knight from defending h7. Capablanca plays queen f3, lining up his queen with black's king, and maybe black realizes that escaping to e8 is actually not a good idea because moves like knight f5 and d5 trying to open the e-file would put black in a tough spot. So black clumsily moves his king back to g8. Now black just wasted 2 moves moving his king back and forth, and he is about to get punished. Capablanca's knight leaps to f5, exploiting the pin on the pawn and attacking the queen. She flees to c7 before white stunningly sacrifices the knight on h6 with check. This takes advantage of the overloaded pawn, as black should not recapture the knight because it would hang his own knight. So black moves his king for a record 3rd time, dodging check. Capablanca thrusts forward with d5, opening his bishop's gaze and threatening to simply take twice on e6. Black captures the pawn before white's bishop eliminates the defensive knight, and after black recaptures, he wins a pawn on f6 with his queen while threatening a checkmating combination of rook takes e6, exploiting the pin on the pawn, and then queen h8 checkmate. So black moves the king out of danger, but Capablanca plays a marvelous sacrifice, capturing on e6 with the rook anyway. Black, with no other choice, is forced to recapture the rook, and white's queen captures on e6 with check. If black blocks, then bishop g6 followed by queen g8 would be checkmate. So black shifts the king over. Finally, Capablanca plays queen f6 check and black resigns. Black is unable to block the check because of white's knight, so he would have to move the king to e8, after which white could play rook e1 with check, the king would move, and then bishop f5 would be checkmate. Capablanca sacrificed a full rook in this one to put on a spectacular performance that led to a stunning checkmate. The next opponent is Guillermo Vassaux, a former Guatemalan chess champion. This game does not start like a usual Queen's Gambit, as Capablanca plays knight f3 on move 1. Black takes the center with d5. White opens his bishop with e3. Black develops his knight to f6, and white strikes with c4. Black capturing would help white develop, so he plays c6 to support his pawn, and white plays knight c3 adding pressure, so black solidifies his pawn with e6. Finally, Capablanca plays d4, transposing into a standard Queen's Gambit position. Black develops his knight to d7, and only after white develops his bishop to d3 does black capture the pawn on c4, forcing white to waste a move by moving his bishop a second time to recapture. Black develops the bishop, pinning the knight before both sides castle their kings. White plays queen e2 to develop the queen off the back rank, and black follows suit. Then Capablanca jumps his knight into a dominant position in the center. Black could capture the knight, but it would give white a nice space advantage after the pawn recaptures. White would also be the first to take the d-file if this were to happen. Instead, black undermines the knight with c5 by challenging white's central pawn on d4. White fortifies his knight's post with f4. Black's knight b6 attacks the bishop, so white retreats it to b3. Then black hops the knight to d5, where it pressures some soft spots in white's camp. Capablanca develops his bishop to defend his knight. Black captures the knight with the bishop, and white recaptures with the pawn to preserve his bishop pair. This allows black to target the c3 pawn with knight e5, adding an attacker while also attacking the bishop. White saves his bishop, and black could capture the pawn on c3 if he wanted, but things would get complicated after queen d3. We see that the knight would actually be trapped, and although black might have a way to get himself out of trouble, it would not come without a penalty. Back to the game. Black goes for f6 instead, hitting the knight. White counterattacks with queen d3 while defending his pawn, and in wanting to secure his powerful knight, black pushes the f-pawn again. Now Capablanca wants to stop all counterplay before launching his own attack. He plays a4 to stop any black expansion on the queen side. Black follows with king h8, getting out of the line of sight of white's bishop. Then white storms the king side with g4, with the threat of capturing on f5, leaving black unable to recapture, as capturing with the rook hangs the knight on e4, and capturing with the pawn hangs the knight on d5. So black plays knight f6, hitting g4 and getting one of the knights out of harm's way so that he can recapture the f-pawn if it were captured. Capablanca starts bringing all of his pieces towards the king side, starting with bishop h4, pinning the knight to the queen. Black develops his bishop, and white lifts the rook up to soon swing it over to the h-file. When the h-file clears up, knight g6, exploiting the pin on the pawn to the king, would be a devastating fork. In light of this, black drops the bishop back to e8 to defend his kingside. White moves the rook over to the h-file, putting the culmination of his attack one step closer to fruition. Black gets his queen out of the pin, freeing up his knight to capture the pawn, so white captures on f5 and black recaptures, opening up the bishop that now locks the black king in a corner. Now black's king is still well defended for now, so Capablanca calmly carries on, improving his position by activating his rook on the d-file, where it is in line with the enemy queen. Black captures the pawn on d4, paving the way for his queen to infiltrate white's queenside, and white recaptures with the pawn, opening up his own queen to swing over to the kingside. Black's queen a3 attacks the bishop while pressuring the a4 pawn. White counterattacks with bishop e6, hitting f5, so black defends it with g6. Capablanca moves his bishop to g5, threatening bishop h6 to trap the rook. So black captures the bishop, and white recaptures with the pawn, hitting the knight. Although white's position is becoming more and more commanding, black has a couple ways to defend. Queen e7 is the best bet, counterattacking the bishop and defending the kingside laterally. Instead, black plays knight e4, which is the losing move. Can you find how white wins? The move Capablanca plays is rook takes h7. Black is forced to recapture, then queen h3 check forces the king to g7, and the final move of the game is queen h6 checkmate. Capablanca furtively prepared this combination for a number of moves, and at his first opportunity he expertly executed it. The third opponent is Cornel Havasi, a former Hungarian chess champion, and he meets the queen's gambit with e6 defending his pawn. After Capablanca's knight f6, black double backs and accepts the gambit. In doing so, black has drastically diminished his influence over the center, and white immediately seizes the territory with e4, creating a powerful central pawn duo. White's bishop has also just been opened up to recapture the pawn. Now black could try to hold on to the pawn, but white would get a massive lead in development and a very good position. So black plays c5, challenging white's center. Capablanca develops by recapturing the gambit pawn. Black takes on d4 and white recaptures, centralizing his knight. Knight f6 develops with tempo while attacking the pawn, and knight c3 defends. Black continues a6, signaling a potential expansion on the queen side, and white castles. Black's bishop c5 develops while adding an attacker to the knight, so white plays bishop e3 defending. Then black develops the knight to d7, probably wanting to keep his bishop protected, but this cuts off the light-squared bishop's defense of e6. Capablanca capitalizes on this misstep, capturing the pawn on e6 with the bishop. Now black should just admit his mistake and castle, letting white keep the extra pawn. Instead, he captures the bishop. Things go from bad to worse for black after white recaptures on e6 with an attack on the queen, the bishop twice, and the pawn on g7. The queen moves to a5 where it can defend the bishop, leaving white free to take the pawn on g7 with check. The king counterattacks and white retreats the knight to f5. In this sequence, Capablanca has gotten 3 pawns for the piece while leaving black's king on the edge of a precipice. Black's knight e5 activates the knight and opens the bishop. Then white strikes with queen b3 check. Now black could block with the bishop, but it leaves him susceptible to knight h6 trying to deflect the king away from the defense of the bishop, and it also just hangs the b7 pawn. So black dodges with king g6. Capablanca plays rook c1, x-raying the bishop with ideas of discovered attack tactics. Black chooses to drop the bishop all the way back to avoid these. Then white moves the knight to e2 in the process of rerouting it towards the king side. In anticipation of this, black plays h5, opening up a square for the king to retreat to. White activates his final piece with rook d1, and black shifts his rook over to the g-file in line with the white king. Capablanca launches forth knight f4 with check, and the king retreats to h7. White continues with bishop b6, attacking the queen and aiming to support a white rook infiltration on the 7th rank. Black slides the queen to b5, offering a queen exchange. White first invades the 7th rank with check, and after the king moves, he accepts the queen exchange. Black recaptures, and white follows up with rook d8, putting black under immense pressure. The bishop is attacked twice and is pinned to the rook. Black's only defense is to move the bishop out of the way of the other rook's lateral defense. The bishop has very few safe squares to move to, and g7 is not an option because white would capture the rook with check to remove a defender of the bishop and then take the bishop for free. So black's only choice is bishop b4. But maybe at this moment, black fell prey to Capablanca's fearsome aura, missing his saving grace and instead capturing the pawn on a2, giving away the bishop without any resistance. White has regained the sacrifice piece and is now just up 2 pawns. He also saw black's checkmate threat on a1, so he correctly captured with the higher rook to double them on the c-file in order to defend. Next, black's knight c4 is a clever way to interfere with white's control of the c-file, creating a double threat of checkmate and on the bishop. But Capablanca simply plays h6, creating an escape for his king, allowing black to capture the bishop. He understands that his dominant position offers him a ton of tactics, such as capturing the bishop on f8, which regains the piece. Black should not recapture because of knight g6, and after the king moves, knight h6 checkmate. Black's knight d7 attacking the rook is met by rook f7 doubling on the 7th rank. Black captures another pawn, and after white's knight d5, black resigns. The black knight is under attack, and it cannot move without hanging the other knight, which would include a double threat of recapturing the knight and checkmate. Moreover, if black were to let white capture the knight, he wouldn't even be able to recapture because it would still give white rook h7 checkmate. So black has no way of not losing a decisive amount of material, and his position is beyond redemption. The fourth opponent is Stoewhaas, and he meets the queen's gambit with e6, opening up his bishop. Capablanca develops the knight to c3, adding pressure to the d5 pawn, and black pins the knight to the king. White develops the other knight to f3 to prepare bishop g5, and black plays a knight c6. Then white swoops the bishop to g5, attacking the queen, so black blocks by developing his knight. White continues e3 to open his kingside bishop. Black's h6 attacks the bishop, so it retreats to h4, maintaining the pin before black lifts his queen to e7, hinting that he might castle queenside. Capablanca proceeds his development with rook c1, putting the rook on a file that will soon open up. Black develops his bishop, paving the way for a long castle, and white plays a3, attacking the bishop. Black should not retreat, as the bishop would quickly get trapped. So he captures the knight, and white recaptures with the rook to keep it active. Then black pushes g5, forcing white's bishop back to g3. Finally, black castles long. Capablanca unleashes a queenside pawn storm with b4. Black decides that he does not want to gradually get trampled, so he captures on b4, steering up chaos in the position while white's king is still in the center. White recaptures, and black takes the pawn with his queen, getting 2 pawns for the piece and attacking and pinning the rook to the king. White plays queen b3, defending and offering a queen exchange now that he's up material. Black drops his queen back to a5, maintaining the pin and creating the threat of queen a1 check, followed by bishop a4, attacking the queen, who wouldn't be able to move because of queen d1 checkmate behind it. In light of this, Capablanca plays knight d2 so that his king can escape the attack using the knight as a shield. Queen a1 check is followed by king e2, and bishop a4 attacking the queen. After the queen moves to a3, black plays queen d1 check, and the king is able to move safely to d3. Black's knight jumps to e4, attacking the rook and piling up on the pinned knight. Now white could defend with queen b2 or queen c1, but both of these moves might offer black decent chances to attack the white king. Instead, Capablanca plays pawn captures d5, opening his rook to cooperate with the bishop in attacking c7. However, white's last move unfortunately gives black a checkmate in 4, which starts with bishop b5 check. White would be forced to capture the knight on e4, then queen g4 would force white to block the check, as king e5 would be met with queen f5 checkmate. And either way that white were to block, let's say with the pawn, white would capture on e5, luring the king to e5, after which queen e6 would be checkmate. Back to the game. Black misses this checkmate, capturing the knight on e2 instead, with what looks like a devastating attack. The only issue for black is that even though Capablanca's king is forced into the center after it captures the knight on e4, black might not even have a way to attack. He captures on d5, and white's king continues its glorious march into uncharted waters. Black could carry on with the checks with bishop d7, but white's king would just go to f6, where it's untouchable. Then black would not have a way to defend both his a7 and c7 pawns. So black plays rook a7, defending. After all this, black sacrificed a piece for a dangerous attack, but was unable to convert this into a victory. Now Capablanca turns the tables on black, building an attack of his own. He knows he cannot capture the bishop without hanging his rook, so he moves the queen to b4 with the threat of rook takes c7 check, with a discovered attack on the queen. Black sees this and moves the queen out of harm's way. Then white develops his bishop to b5 while hitting both the bishop and the rook. White's other rook will soon land on either c1 or b1 with decisive threats. Black, in a final desperate bid for counterplay, plays bishop c2 check. Capablanca safely tucks his king away on, of all possible squares, f6. Black plays bishop g6, and after white's rook c1, black resigns. Not only is black's rook hanging, the threat of checkmate is unstoppable. If black does nothing, then white will capture twice on c7. The king would not be able to move towards the center because of queen e7 checkmate, so it would be forced into the path of discovered checks. Rook c8 would be an amazing sacrifice, leading to queen c5 check and queen c7 checkmate. Going back, the other option is pushing the pawn, after which white would still sacrifice the rook, and black would be forced to recapture, as moving the king would lead to back rank checkmates, and capturing would open up bishop a6, and the king would not be able to move because of queen b8 checkmate, so the rook would be forced to block, leading to a clean checkmate in 2. So Capablanca just took his king on a long stroll across town while miraculously surviving a deadly attack, and he flipped the script of the game in an instant. The next opponent is Charles Jaffe, a very strong chess master. Capablanca does not immediately offer the gambit, playing knight f3 and black replies knight f6. After each side supports their respective centers with e3 and c6, white unveils the queen's gambit with c4. Black declines, playing e6 to create a sturdy central construction. White develops his other knight to c3 and black plays knight b to d7. Then white develops his bishop to d3, black develops his to d6, and both sides castle. At this juncture, Capablanca strikes in the center with e4, challenging black's most influential pawn. And with the looming threat of e5 creating a fork, black captures the pawn, inviting white's knight into the center. Black captures the knight, luring white's bishop to e4, where it becomes a target for the other knight. White saves his bishop. Now, if allowed, white will play queen d3, targeting h7, followed by bishop g5 to remove the defender. So black immediately plays h7, putting a stop to all of these plans. With the bishop's options limited on the open diagonal, Capablanca plays b3, creating a new avenue for development. Black, with no way to develop his own bishop to an active square, takes inspiration playing b7. Then both sides fianchetto their bishops on the long diagonal. Then white plays queen d3 with menacing ideas on the king side. The threat now is to play d5, opening up the bishop to capture the knight and remove the defender of h7. Black's best bet would be to play rook e8 to give enough support to meet d5 with e5 blocking the diagonal. Instead, black plays g6, which also stops the threat, but weakens the kingside pawns. Capablanca puts a plan under motion to rip open black's kingside, and it starts with rook a to e1, activating his rook on the semi-open file. Black follows with knight h5, trying to reroute the knight to a more active square. And white plays bishop c1, targeting the weak h6 pawn. King g7 defends, and now white plays a marvelous move. Rook takes e6. If black recaptures, then queen g6, king h8, and queen h7 would be checkmate. But white is also threatening to capture on g6 with the rook and then play this similar mating combination of queen g6 followed by queen h7. So black must block the rook's vision of g6 and plays a knight f6. Capablanca advances his knight, putting untenable pressure on black's kingside. Black replies c5, opening his bishop and trying to undermine white's defense of the knight. But the game is all but over for black. White sacrifices his bishop, capturing on h6 with check. Now black could avoid recapturing, but he'd be down a second pawn for nothing, and white will most likely have a devastating attack in the coming moves. Instead, black takes the bishop, and Capablanca plays the game's final move, knight takes f7, and black resigns. Almost anywhere the king goes, queen g6 would be checkmate. And if the king goes to h5, then queen h3 would be checkmate. That was a short and sweet 20-move victory by Capablanca. The sixth opponent is Glicco, and he meets the queen's gambit with knight f6 followed by e6. After Capablanca's knight c3, black establishes a central pawn presence with d5. White continues bishop g5, pinning the knight to the queen and undermining black's defense of the center. So black plays knight b to d7 so that he can replace his knight with a new knight in case white were to capture it. Then white plays e3 to open up his kingside pieces, and black plays c6, further solidifying his center pawn. Capablanca's rook c1 puts the rook on a soon-to-be semi-open file, and black replies bishop e7, preparing to castle. White, in wanting to castle soon as well, develops his knight to f3, and after black castles, he develops his bishop to d3, paving the way to castle kingside. Since white's bishop has already moved, though, black captures the pawn on c4, forcing white to waste a second move on his bishop to recapture. Then black plays knight d5, centralizing his knight and offering a bishop exchange, which white accepts before black recaptures with the queen. Finally, white castles, and black brings his rook to the open d-file in line with white's queen. Next, Capablanca plays knight e4, starting a plan to build an attack on the king side by rerouting his pieces towards that direction. Black drops the knight back to f6 to challenge white's central knight, and white continues with knight g3. Black's h6 is a useful move, creating air for the king and stopping any piece from landing on g5. Then white seizes control of the center with e4. To prevent white from gaining too much space with e5, black plays e5 himself. However, this surrenders control of the f5 square, and Capablanca immediately makes the most out of it with knight f5 attacking the queen and putting the knight on an intimidating square. The queen drops back to f8 and white leaves no piece untouched, bringing his rook to the central e-file. Then black plays g6 to kick white's dominant knight. But this was a mistake, and Capablanca capitalizes. He captures the pawn on f7 with check. Now if the queen recaptures, then knight h6 would simply be a royal fork. On the other hand, if the king recaptures, then white's only move would be queen b3 check. Black shouldn't move the king because queen e6 would lead to checkmate. He would be forced to block with the knight, which white would capture, and even though black could grab white's knight, white would ultimately win even more material. Back to the game. So black's only good option is king g7, where it defends the g6 pawn. But Capablanca takes that one too. At this point, black cannot go on giving away free pawns to white, so he captures the bishop with his king. Then white captures the pawn on e5, forcing the knight to move, and it goes to g8 to somewhat support his king side. White lifts his rook in order to bring more infantry to the front lines. Then black plays the sneaky knight f6, opening a discovered attack on white's queen. Capablanca, unfazed, moves his queen out of the way, and black now must retreat his knight, and at this point, you'd think this was a Fischer random game. White jumps his knight to h4, giving check, and the king retreats to h7. White's queen leaps into the heart of the battle. Black for now defends admirably, capturing the knight on f5. White recaptures with the pawn, controlling key squares on black's king side, before black lifts his rook one square to defend the 7th rank. Capablanca's f6 covers the king's escape route, while opening the f5 square where the queen can lay eyes on the enemy king. Now the threat is queen f5, forcing the king to h8, after which knight g6 would be devastating. So black captures the pawn on f6, sacrificing his knight in order to grant his king some freedom. White, however, wants more than just the knight. He plays queen f5 check. The king moves to g7, then he captures the knight on f6 with check, before black recaptures with the other knight. Capablanca storms in with rook g3 check. Now black could go to the corner, but he would run into knight g6. And he could also delay the inevitable by just giving away pieces for free. Instead, he moves the king to f7, allowing Capablanca to end the game with one swift blow, queen e6 checkmate. This was an epic display of Capablanca's skill, as he employed every single one of his pieces to administer an astounding attack. The name of the second last opponent is unknown, but the game itself is especially memorable. Both sides have already developed a pair of knights, and black meets the queen's gambit with e6. White plays knight c3, building the pressure on black's center. Black continues bishop d6 developing, and white plays bishop g5, pinning the knight and undermining black's defense of the center. So black plays c6, securing the d5 pawn. White's e3 opens up the bishop, and black castles. Capablanca plays rook c1, avoiding developing his bishop because he'd prefer black captures the pawn first, so he would only have to move it once to recapture. And what do you know? The patience pays off because black captures on the next move. White develops his bishop by recapturing, and white develops his knight to support his pinned knight. Then white notices that his bishop is currently biting on concrete, so he moves it back to d3 so that it becomes more active. Black drops his bishop back 2 so that he can break the pin, and white castles. Then black plays b6 in order to develop his last minor piece. Capablanca's queen c7 creates a battery along the diagonal towards the h7 pawn. For now it's well defended, so black continues his development with bishop b7. Then white plays knight e5, and now there's a threat to capture both knights and then win the pawn on h7. So black plays g6, blunting the diagonal. But this gives white the opportunity to control key squares around the king with bishop h6, which also attacks the rook. The rook evades the attack before white shifts his own rook to the d-file where it is in line with the enemy queen. Now black is at a space disadvantage, which means he has less room for his pieces, so he would prefer to exchange them off. He starts by taking the knight on e5, and after white recaptures attacking black's knight, he moves it to d5. Capablanca captures the knight, and black should not recapture with the c-pawn as it would allow bishop b5 trapping black's rook. So black recaptures with the e-pawn. This makes way for the clever pawn advance, e6. Black should not capture the pawn as it would allow white to capture on g6, after which black should not recapture the bishop unless he wants to get checkmated. Black's only choice is to blunt the diagonal by pushing the pawn to f5. Capablanca's aggressive spirit springs to life as he still sacrifices the bishop, in this case on f5. Black recaptures, and white's queen takes the pawn, jumping in awfully close to the naked king. The threat now is queen f7 followed by queen g7 checkmate. So black blocks the queen's path with bishop f6. This also defends against queen g4 because the king could safely tuck itself away in the corner, and the black bishop serves as a valiant defender. Capablanca presses on with e4, trying to open up the position, and black replies queen e7, attacking the e6 pawn and defending the king laterally. White captures on e5, and after black recaptures, he plays a clever move. Rook c7. This sacrifices the rook to deflect the queen away from the bishop, which white picks up next. Capablanca accurately evaluated that black's bishop was vital in the defense of black's king, so giving up the rook for it was most certainly worth it. Black returns the queen, desperately offering a queen exchange, but white refuses, dropping the queen back to where it still keeps a keen eye on the g7 square. Black shifts his rook over a square in an attempt to offer more queen trades, and white responds with rook d3 with a move with destructive intent. Then black plays queen f6, attacking the queen and threatening a devastating check on f2. But white has checkmate in 3 here. Can you find it? The move Capablanca plays is rook g3 check. Black could block with the queen, but white would capture it and then play queen g7 checkmate. So black moves the king to the corner. Finally, white plays bishop g7 check, and black resigns. If the queen takes the bishop, then queen takes g7 is checkmate. And if the king moves to g8, then bishop f6 would uncover a spectacular discovered checkmate. And hey, if I got dismantled like black did in this game, I'd want my name to be forgotten too. The final opponent is Gilbert Hadland, an English chess player, and Capablanca offers a delayed queen's gambit which black declines, developing his knight to f6. White pins the knight to the king, and black moves his other knight to d7 to give support. White proceeds with e3, opening up his kingside bishop, and black plays bishop e7, preparing to castle. White's knight b to d2 supports the c4 pawn so that his bishop is no longer tied down to its defense. Then black castles. Capablanca continues activating all of his pieces with rook c1 before black plays c6, solidifying his center. White develops his bishop to d3, aiming at the kingside, and black drops his knight back to e8, offering an exchange of bishops. White declines, trying to keep more pieces on the board. Black carries on with f4, creating a firm grip over the e4 square. He'll soon place a knight there. White pushes c5, clamping down on the queenside. Then black plays knight f6, looking at e4. Capablanca jumps his own knight into an active post on e5 with the other idea of opening up the f3 square so that he can meet black's knight e4 with f3 dislodging it. Black captures white's knight on e2 and white recaptures with the queen. Then black jumps his other knight to f6. At this point, white has a space advantage on the queen side, so why not get one on the king side too? He plays h4 with an attack on the black king in mind. Black retreats his knight back to where it came from, opening up 2 attackers on the h4 pawn. Capablanca shifts his queen over to f2 to add a defender before black plays bishop f6, attempting to eliminate white's powerful knight. White should not let black capture the knight because recapturing with the pawn would create a very closed position in which his bishop pair would not fare well. And recapturing with the bishop would give black the chance of exchanging off more pieces. So white stops this altogether by capturing black's knight, and black recaptures with the queen. Then Capablanca's kingside pawn storm rages on with g4. Black would be in trouble if he lets white open the g-file or even push the pawn, so he captures it himself, and white recaptures with the f-pawn. Then black moves the queen to f7, creating a battery along the open f-file. White presses on with g5, attacking the bishop, and black cleverly captures on d4, exploiting the overloaded e3 pawn, which should not capture, as it would hang the white bishop on f4. Capablanca, cool as a cucumber, just keeps pushing his pawns with h5. Now black's only hope is to exchange pieces and go for a queen exchange. He could play queen takes f4, exploiting the pin on the pawn, and white would have no choice but to exchange queens. Black would end up getting 2 pawns despite losing the exchange. Back to the game. Instead, black plays bishop e5, a fatal mistake. Capablanca's bishop bursts through to h7, capturing the pawn with check, and black should not recapture because g6 would land a brutal fork on the king and queen. So he moves the king to h8. Then white moves the bishop back to g6, attacking the queen. After she moves, he captures the bishop on e5, sacrificing his own queen, which black takes with the rook. Capablanca does not even recapture, pushing h6 to ferociously rip open the h-file. And there's just no hope for black. He does not have any defense for what is about to come. He captures the pawn on g5, giving white an unstoppable checkmate in 2. The move Capablanca plays is pawn takes g7 with a double check. After the king moves to its only safe square, g8, white plays rook h8, checkmate. And what a game to end on. Capablanca plays a beautiful queen sacrifice leading to an exquisite checkmate. I hope these games were both entertaining and instructive. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chess content.